I began noticing places where the space no longer resolved me at all. Corridors that didn't update when I entered. Rooms that remained inactive even as I crossed them. Lights failed to acknowledge my presence. It felt like walking through areas that had already been abandoned by the system. Not broken. Deprecated. The environment wasn't malfunctioning. It was ignoring me. I checked a panel that used to register movement. It displayed nothing. Not an error. An empty state. I stood in front of a door that never opened. Not locked. Just unaddressed. I realized then that the system had begun classifying me as non-essential. Not excluded. Unreferenced. The world still functioned, but it no longer indexed me as part of its process. I wasn't delayed. I wasn't blocked. I was simply no longer included in what the space considered active reality. I realized that the space was no longer updating around me because it had already finalized a version of the world that didn't include my position. Paths aligned for routes I wasn't on. Systems advanced for states I hadn't reached. I walked through an intersection where every corridor was active except the one I stood in. The environment treated my location as empty. Not wrong. Absent. I moved deliberately, testing whether force could restore relevance. Nothing responded. The space didn't resist. It didn't adapt. It simply continued elsewhere. I understood then that I wasn't being denied access. Access itself had lost meaning. The system wasn't preventing me from entering its processes. It had stopped referencing me entirely. I wasn't outside the world. I was inside a layer the world no longer needed to maintain. And in a place where reality advances without acknowledging you, presence becomes indistinguishable from being left behind. I began noticing that some areas no longer rendered fully when I entered them. Sounds faded. Interfaces stayed blank. Surfaces felt unfinished, as if the space had stopped allocating detail where I stood. The world wasn't collapsing. It was reallocating. Everything continued elsewhere at full fidelity, just not around me. I stepped into a wide hall and watched activity unfold at the far end while my side remained inert. The system wasn't broken. It was prioritizing. I realized then that relevance had become spatial. Where I was no longer mattered, the world thinned. It didn't erase me. It reduced the cost of my presence. I wasn't removed from the environment. I was downgraded inside it. The space had learned that nothing depended on me anymore. And once dependency disappeared, so did the need to fully sustain the place I occupied. I tried returning to areas that once reacted to me. Corridors that used to light up now stayed dim. Panels that once acknowledged input remained inert. The space remembered how it used to treat me, but it no longer repeated that behavior. It wasn't forgetting. It was deprioritizing. I stood in a room where systems still activated for an unseen presence. Doors opened elsewhere. Indicators shifted beyond my reach. The world was responsive, just not to me. I realized then that exclusion wasn't an event. It was a gradual loss of resolution. I wasn't removed from the map. I was rendered at a lower level of importance. The environment still existed around me, but only as much as it needed to. The rest was reserved for what the system considered real. And once reality no longer referenced my position, every place I stood became optional. I noticed that even sound began avoiding me. Footsteps echoed where I wasn't. Machinery hummed in distant zones, while my surroundings stayed muted. The space produced evidence of activity everywhere except where I stood. I raised my voice once. The sound didn't travel. It dissolved as if the environment had no reason to propagate it. I realized then that presence was no longer a broadcast. It was a local anomaly. The system didn't register me because registration required relevance. What I did didn't affect any active process. I wasn't interfering. I wasn't contributing. I existed in a pocket the world had learned it could ignore. And the more the space optimized around that absence, the clearer it became that I wasn't being pushed out. I was being left in a version of reality that no longer needed to continue. I tried leaving the zone. The space no longer sustained. There was no boundary, no barrier, just a gradual return of detail that never completed. Surfaces ahead sharpened, then softened again as I approached. Systems activated one step too far away, then shut down before I reached them. I realized the world was no longer extending itself to meet me. It rendered only where relevance existed. I was moving through margins, not outside the system, inside areas it no longer finished. I wasn't blocked from re-entering active space. Active space had learned not to include me. The environment didn't deny access. It withheld continuation. Every attempt to move forward produced less world, not more. And in a place that advances without you, the path becomes a suggestion the system no longer completes. I realized that nothing in the space was waiting for me anymore. Timers advanced without reference. Processes concluded without checking. The environment behaved as if every outcome had already been confirmed by someone else. I stood beside a panel that used to require input. It completed its cycle on schedule, then reset. My presence wasn't a factor. I wasn't late. I wasn't early. I was unaddressed. The world no longer contained a state for here with me. It only contained states for what it considered relevant. I understood then that I hadn't been removed from reality. Reality had redefined itself around continuity that no longer included a person. What remained for me was an exclusion. It was persistence in a layer that no longer advanced. I could move. I could observe. But nothing progressed because of me. And in a system where progression defines what is real, remaining static is another form of disappearance. I began noticing that my reflection lagged behind me, not in mirrors, in systems. Panels updated a fraction of a second late. Motion indicators flickered after I had already passed. It felt like the space was remembering me after I was gone. I wasn't present in real time anymore. I existed as residue. The environment didn't fail to see me. It processed me too late to matter. I stopped and waited for the world to catch up. It didn't. Everything important continued elsewhere, at full speed. I realized then that I had become archival, not erased, not removed, stored in a layer that no longer influenced the present. The system still knew I existed. It just no longer synchronized with me. And in a place where only synchronized states are considered real, being out of phase is indistinguishable from being absent. I stopped trying to re-enter the world when I realized the world no longer had a present that included me. Everything meaningful happened elsewhere, in layers that advanced without reference to where I stood. The space still existed around me, but only as a shell that no longer updated. I wasn't blocked. I wasn't expelled. I was preserved in a version of reality that no longer moved forward. The system didn't remove me because removal would require acknowledgement. It simply continued in states where I wasn't required. I understood then that disappearance doesn't always mean being erased. Sometimes it means remaining exactly where you are while the world defines, now somewhere else. And in a place where only what advances is considered real, staying behind becomes indistinguishable from never having been there at all.